The classification was a monument to our own arrogance. A single crisp line of text in the grand strategic archive of the Vorlag hegemony, a record I myself had verified and sealed. It read, Terran Liaison Officer Eva Rostova, classification, non-combatant. I remember my upper appendages twitching in what passed for a Vorlag chuckle as I processed it. To us, to the hegemony, a non-combatant was a biological fact, not a chosen role. It was a designation for the infirm, the larval, the species so utterly devoid of natural defenses or martial inclination that to even consider them in a strategic context was a waste of processing cycles. And the human, Rostova, fit every metric. Her species was a litany of biological vulnerabilities, soft, unarmored flesh, a fragile endoskeleton, pathetically limited sensory inputs. Her dossier stated she hailed from their high-gravity death world, a fact we typically noted as a minor curiosity explaining their surprising musculature and endurance. But it was like noting a particular species of rock had high density before you pulverized it. It was an irrelevant detail in the face of overwhelming force. My name is High Scribe Xylok, and for 300 solar cycles, my existence has been dedicated to the preservation and analysis of data. Logic is the air I process, and precedent is the ground upon which I stand. My 4 optic stalks can simultaneously review strategic fleet movements, casualty reports, resource allocation tables, and historical precedents. I am a living repository of the art of war, as practiced by the Vorlag hegemony, and our art was one of overwhelming, mathematically precise force. For a century of that time, our masterpiece of attrition had been the war against the Cathar Collective. They were our mirror opposites. Where we were calculated, they were frenzied. Where we were logical, they were fanatically honor-bound. They were a species of hulking, chitin-plated warriors, born and bred for conflict. Their psychology was a fortress, their societal structure a weapon. They felt no fear as we understood it, only a burning desire for glorious battle. Our psionic warfare divisions, which could shatter the minds of lesser species, simply glanced off their unyielding certainty. Our fleets could grind their fleets down, our armies could shatter their legions, but we could not break their will. It was a stalemate measured in generations and megatons, a war of numbers where both sides were slowly bleeding into the void. The Terran Alliance was a junior partner in this conflict, a recent addition to the galactic stage. We used their Marines as rapid deployment shock troops, their scrappy, over-engineered ships as pickets and scouts. They were useful in the way a sharpened tool is useful, but we never considered them architects of strategy. So, when the data slate bearing Eva Rostova's name came to my console, I classified her as logic dictated. She was a cultural liaison officer, a diplomatic title so absurdly pointless in a war of extermination that it bordered on comedy. Her purpose was, in theory, to facilitate understanding. To the Vorlag command, this was like hiring a poet to lecture a supernova, and thus, non-combatant. It was a neat, logical, and utterly wrong classification. It was the single greatest error in the history of the Grand Strategic Archive, and the story of that error is not one of kinetic obliteration, but of a quiet, terrifying collapse. It began not with an explosion, but with a smile. The human arrived at the High Command Citadel on Xylos Prime, looking exactly as unimpressive as her files suggested. The corridors of the Citadel are scaled for Vorlag command staff, each archway wide enough for 3 of my kind to walk abreast, our armored carapaces barely brushing. Eva Rostova seemed to shrink in the space, a small, soft-shelled organism adrift in a sea of titans. I observed her from my elevated scriptorium, my lower optic stalks tracking her slow, deliberate pace, while my upper 2 monitored the ebb and flow of strategic data from the front. She wore a simple, dark blue uniform, devoid of the polished armor or energy shielding, favored by every other sentient being in the room. You could see the vulnerability of her neck, the soft give of the flesh on her hands. To a Vorlag, she was an open wound, an invitation to violence. The other members of the High Command, the true combatants, made no effort to hide their disdain. General Vrox, his crimson-banded command armor gleaming under the lumen panels, clicked his primary mandibles in a staccato rhythm of pure contempt as she passed. His sub-commanders, a phalanx of hardened warriors who had personally glassed moons and shattered asteroid fortresses, shifted their massive frames to give her a wide berth, as if her fragility were a contagion. They were the hammers of the hegemony, and they saw her as a piece of decorative glass, inexplicably placed in a forge. She did not seem to notice, or, if she did, she displayed no outward signs of intimidation. This was the first anomaly I recorded. Her biometric readings, which I had taken the liberty of accessing, were a flat line. Her respiratory rate was even, her pulse a steady rhythmic beat. In a room saturated with the pheromonal equivalent of aggression and superiority, she was an island of absolute calm. It was unnatural. As she approached the central dais, she paused. A junior archivist, a young Vorlag barely out of his larval stage, had fumbled a stack of data slates. They clattered to the polished chrome floor, a minor disruption, a moment of personal shame for the youngling. The generals ignored him. I prepared to make a note of the archivist's clumsiness for his performance review. But the human, Rostova, stopped. She knelt down, a gesture that must have strained her primitive bipedal joint structure, and began to help the archivist gather the slates. She spoke to him in a low, quiet tone. I adjusted my audio sensors to listen. She was not giving an order. She was reassuring him. She said, "Happens to the best of us. Let's get these sorted before someone important steps on them." She then produced that most unsettling of human expressions, the smile, a slow parting of the lips to bare the flat, white enamel of her teeth. It was not a threat display as we understood it, yet my threat assessment subroutines flickered with uncertainty. The young archivist, flustered and terrified, simply stared. General Vrox finally lost what little patience his species possessed. He strode forward, his heavy footfalls echoing like seismic charges. "Liaison Officer Rostova," he boomed, his voice a low-frequency rumble that vibrated the very deck plates. "The War Council is convened to discuss strategy, not to assist fumbling menials. State your purpose, or remove yourself from this chamber." Eva Rostova stood up, handing the last slate to the archivist with a final, unnerving smile. She turned to face the towering general, a being who could have snapped her spine with one of his tertiary limbs. She didn't flinch. Her calm was absolute. "General Vrox," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the vast chamber. "I am here to offer a different kind of leverage." Vrox's mandibles clicked once, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Leverage? Soft skin? What leverage could you possibly offer that 1,000 of my kinetic bombardment platforms cannot?" Her smile widened fractionally. It didn't reach her eyes, which were a cool, analytical gray. "You've been trying to break down their door for a century, General," she said. "I'm here to find the key." I recorded the exchange verbatim, noting her response as illogical and needlessly poetic. It was a line that would haunt me for the remainder of my cycles. The war ground on, as it always did. The siege of Xylos Prime became the new focal point of our attrition, a meat grinder for ships and souls. The Cathar, fighting with the fury of zealots, had dug in deep. For every meter of territory our ground forces gained, we paid for it in the carapaces of 100 Vorlag soldiers. For every Cathar cruiser we vaporized, 2 more seemed to take its place, their commanders eager for a glorious death. In the high command citadel, a miasma of frustration settled. General Vrox and his staff grew more agitated with each passing cycle, their strategic sessions devolving into bellowed arguments over trajectories and blast radiuses. They were trying to solve a puzzle by hitting it with a bigger hammer, and the puzzle was only growing more complex. It was in this atmosphere of stagnant fury that Eva Rostova made her formal request to the War Council. She did not ask for a platoon of Terran Marines. She did not request a squadron of fighters or a single plasma torpedo. Her request was, to the assembled military minds of the hegemony, utterly insane. She requested full, unredacted, top-level access to the entirety of the Grand Strategic Archives files on the Cathar Collective. And not just the military files. She wanted everything. Every intercepted communication, no matter how trivial. Every long-range scan of their civilian worlds. She wanted their trade manifests, their geological surveys, their astronomical charts. And then came the request that caused General Vrox's optic stalks to dilate in disbelief. She wanted their art, their poetry, Their musical compositions, their holodramas, their religious texts, the myths they told their larval young. She wanted the data we had flagged as culturally irrelevant and buried under petacycles of strategic analysis. A wave of incredulous murmurs rippled through the council chamber. The very idea was an affront to Vorlog military doctrine. Warfare was a science of applied force, of vectors and yields. It was not a study of literature. General Vrock slammed a massive gauntleted fist onto the central holotable, causing the projection of Xylo's prime to flicker violently. "This is an outrage," he roared. "Our fleets are burning, and this librarian wants to read fairy tales. We need strategists, not storytellers. Request denied." But High Commander Thrax, a more ancient and considered Vorlog, whose carapace was scarred from 100 campaigns, held up a single, three-jointed finger for silence. He turned his multifaceted gaze upon the human. "Explain the strategic value of this research, liaison officer." Eva's expression remained neutral. "The Cathar are not a mathematical problem, High Commander. They are a story. And for a century, you have only been reading the chapter on war. You cannot understand the end of a story by only reading one chapter. To know how to defeat them, you must first understand what they love, what they fear more than death, what they value more than victory." It was a profound and deeply illogical statement. Yet something in its construction, its alien certainty, gave Thrax pause. He turned his gaze to me. "High Scribe Xylok, you are the keeper of this data. What is your assessment?" I weighed the request. It was a colossal waste of resources and processing power. It would divert archival assets from active combat analysis. But it was also contained. It would keep the strange human occupied and out of the way of the real warriors. "High Commander," I projected, my vocalizer crisp and formal. "The request is unorthodox. The probability of discovering actionable, strategic intelligence from non-military data is less than 0.001%. However, the risk of granting access is negligible. It can be seen as a low-cost, low-probability exploratory venture." Thrax considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Grant the liaison officer access. High Scribe, you will oversee her work. Ensure she does not interfere with primary combat operations." My mandibles twitched in annoyance. I was being assigned to babysit a delusional anthropologist. But an order was an order. I escorted Ava Rostova to a sub-level of the Grand Archive, a sterile, silent chamber reserved for deep data analysis. I gave her a console, established her security clearance, and opened the floodgates. I watched as the index of Cathar cultural data scrolled across her screen, petacycles of it, the collected soul of a species. I expected her to recoil, to see the impossibility of her task. I expected her to last a day, maybe two, before admitting defeat. I could not have been more wrong. The cycles that followed were some of the most baffling of my long career. My primary function was to analyze the Cathar fleet's tactical responses, to predict their sorties and counter their feints. But a fraction of my processing power, a persistent and increasingly irritated partition of my consciousness, was dedicated to monitoring the human in the archive. Eva Rostova did not work like a Vorlog. We processed data in parallel, absorbing vast streams of information and running predictive algorithms. She worked in a slow, linear, almost primitive fashion. She did not scan, she read. She sat for hours, utterly still, her eyes fixed on the terminal as she absorbed the epic poems of Cathar antiquity. She watched their holodramas, primitive black and white recordings from millennia past, observing the stilted interactions of their ancient actors. I saw her spend an entire rotation listening to a single, mournful piece of music, a Cathar funeral dirge, a complex arrangement of subsonic vibrations and percussive strikes that our analysts had dismissed as meaningless noise. To me, it was a colossal, infuriating waste of time. While General Vrox was calculating the optimal angle of orbital bombardment to collapse a Cathar command bunker, Eva Rostova was reading a children's story about a young Cathar who befriended a six-legged herbivore. I cross-referenced the data she was accessing with active intelligence. There were no correlations. The names of the mythic heroes were not codes for fleet formations. the ancient religious texts contain no hidden schematics for their shield generators. It was exactly what it appeared to be: sentimental nonsense. After the third cycle of this, my professional patience, a resource I considered nearly infinite, began to fray. I descended from my scriptorium and entered her chamber. The air was still, the only sound the faint hum of the life support and the whisper of the ventilation. She was leaning forward, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen, completely absorbed in a translation of the Kthach Var, a foundational Cathar religious act. The offensive began not with a torpedo salvo, but with a transmission. After nearly a full 10-cycle period sequestered in the archive, Eva Rostova emerged. She didn't go to the tactical holotable or request a briefing on fleet dispositions. She went to the Central Communications Hub, a cavernous chamber staffed by 100 Vorlag technicians, and requested a wide-band, multi-spectrum broadcast channel. General Vrox, who was informed of the request, was about to summarily deny it, but High Commander Thrax, his curiosity apparently piqued by the human's strange persistence, allowed it. I was there, my optic stalk swiveling to observe both the human and the reactions of the command staff. Ava provided the technicians with a simple data packet. It was a minuscule file, barely a few kilobytes. It contained no viruses, no malware, no logic bombs. My own security scans confirmed it was nothing but a simple audio-visual message. At her signal, the technicians broadcast it. The message wasn't aimed at the Cathar High Warlord, Grak Thul. It wasn't even sent to their fleet command. The target signifier she had designated was every individual Cathar vessel, from capital ships down to single-pilot fighters. The broadcast was system-wide, and for a moment, the main viewing screen in the war room showed what the Cathar were receiving. It began with an image, a famous piece of Cathar art I now recognized from her research. It depicted a legendary hero, Kael Mor, standing alone on a barren moon. The accompanying audio was a simple, unadorned recitation, spoken in the Cathar's own guttural language. I had the archive's translation matrix run it in real time. The voice, a calm male tone synthesized to match Cathar vocal patterns, was recounting the myth of Kael Mor. In the story, Kael Mor had sworn a blood oath to protect a small, insignificant clan of farmers. When a massive horde of invaders arrived, his own commanders ordered him to retreat and save his legion. Instead, Kael Mor sent his legion away and remained behind alone, fulfilling his vow. He was overwhelmed and killed, but his honor remained intact. It was a story of sacrifice, a cornerstone of their moral code. As the story ended, the image of Kael Mor faded, replaced by simple, stark. The immediate Cathar response was a profound and unsettling silence. On the grand strategic scale, nothing changed. Their fleets held their positions. Their ground troops continued to fight with the same brutal ferocity on Xylos Prime. The war of attrition continued unabated. To General Vrox and the rest of the War Council, this was proof that the humans' pathetic attempt at psychological warfare had failed. "You see," Vrox broadcast to the entire command staff, his voice dripping with condescending triumph, "their honor is unshakable. Your whispers were meaningless, soft skin. They have ignored your insults." He returned to his maps and his casualty projections, satisfied. But I saw what he did not. My analytical subroutines, tasked with monitoring Cathar tactical efficiency, began to flag microscopic anomalies. A Cathar destroyer squadron, ordered to execute a standard flanking maneuver, was 0.8 seconds slower to respond than the doctrinal average. A ground unit, pinned down by our artillery, broke formation and retreated 12 seconds before their usual breaking point. A fighter wing engaged our interceptors with perfect discipline, but their post-engagement communication logs showed a 300% increase in non-essential chatter. These were minuscule deviations, statistical noise to anyone else. To me, they were the first tremors of an earthquake. The human, Eva Rostova, seemed to expect this. She had returned to her archive chamber and was calmly reviewing more data. 2 cycles after her first broadcast, she made her second move. Again, she went to the communications hub. This time, her data packet was slightly larger. It contained excerpts from Cathar logistical manifests, records our intelligence operatives had painstakingly acquired over decades. These were boring, mundane documents detailing the movement of supplies and resources throughout the Cathar collective. Most strategists would have ignored them, but Ava had spent weeks poring over them. Her new broadcast was, once again, aimed at the entire Cathar fleet. It displayed 2 columns of data side by side. The first column showed the official resource requisitions for medical supplies, nutrient paste, and replacement parts for the legions fighting and dying on Xylos Prime. The second column showed the actual destination of those resources, the construction of a new, lavish ceremonial palace for Warlord Grak Thul on his private moon. She offered no commentary, no accusation. She simply presented the Cathar's own data. Beneath the 2 columns, a single line of text appeared, a quote I recognized from a Cathar children's primer she had been studying. It read, "The leader who feasts while his warriors starve has a hollow soul and a stolen crown." The transmission cut. This time, the effect was instantaneous and undeniable. The flood of internal Cathar communications became a torrent. We began to intercept unencrypted arguments between ship captains. The phrase hollow soul and shattered oath appeared again and again. Their network discipline, once perfect, was fraying at the edges. I left my scriptorium and went to her chamber again. The feeling was no longer annoyance. It was a cold, creeping sense of dread. She was sitting at her console, reviewing her work. Her biometric readings were still a placid sea of calm. It was the calm of a sapper who has just set a long-delay fuse. "Liaison officer," I began, my vocalizer struggling to maintain its usual monotone. "Explain your strategy. Fear is a weapon. It compels an enemy to retreat. Hope is a weapon. It can spark a rebellion. What you are doing, this is not in our doctrines. You are sowing dissent, not terror." She turned to face me, and that unnerving smile, that baring of the teeth, was back. It looked predatory now. "Terror is a fire, high scribe," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It burns hot and fast, but it can be extinguished. Doubt is a cancer. It grows in the dark. It rots the bone. The Cathar believe their honor is their strength, their skeleton. I'm just showing them it's been riddled with disease for years. Their center of gravity is their absolute faith in their leaders. I'm just shifting it a few degrees." The biological metaphor was chillingly precise. A Vorlag would attack the enemy's armor. A Terran, it seemed, would attack their very cells. She was not fighting the Cathar. She was teaching them how to fight themselves. The breaking point came faster than any of my models could have predicted. Warlord Grak Thul, a being who had never once deigned to communicate directly with the Vorlag hegemony, broadcast a message across all channels. His immense, scarred face filled the main screen in our war room, his mandibles twitching with barely controlled fury. He was magnificent and terrifying, the epitome of a Cathar warrior king. He bellowed, his voice distorted with rage, calling the anonymous messages the venomous whispers of a cowardly, soft-skinned species. He decried the Vorlag for resorting to such dishonorable tactics, for using lies and shadows, instead of facing him in glorious combat. And then he issued the challenge. He declared that he, Grak Thul, would lead his entire fleet, spearheaded by his flagship, the Indomitable Will, in a final decisive battle at the heart of the Xylos system. He was calling our bluff, attempting to reclaim the narrative through overwhelming force and personal bravado. To the Vorlag Council, this was the moment they had been waiting for, a decisive fleet engagement. Finally, the war would be decided by principles they understood: firepower, tactics, and strength. General Vrox was ecstatic, his appendages flying across the holotable as he began to array our fleets to meet the challenge. The war room buzzed with the energy of a predator about to strike. In the midst of this, Eva Rostova made her final, most insane request. She asked for a single, unarmed diplomatic shuttle and a pilot. She was going to fly to the coordinates Grak Thul had designated for the battle. She was going to meet the Cathar armada, alone. The council erupted. "Suicide!" Vrox roared. "She's a spy! It's a trick! She means to defect and give them our secrets." Even High Commander Thrax seemed to believe she had finally lost her mind. But before they could have her arrested, she walked to the communications console one last time. "One more message," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Then you can do what you will." Reluctantly, Thrax gave the nod. Her final transmission was a work of diabolical genius. It contained no stories, no data sheets. It was just a simple split-screen display. On the left side was a live feed of her own biometrics. Her pulse was 65 beats per minute. Her breathing was slow and even. Her galvanic skin response was a flat, placid line. On the right side of the screen, she displayed the publicly available biometric data of Warlord Grak Thul, which his own bravado-fueled society posted for all to see. His pulse was a frantic 190. His adrenaline and cortisol levels were in the red. His respiratory rate was shallow and rapid. It was the biological signature of a creature in the grip of panic. Beneath this stark, irrefutable comparison, a single line of text in the Cathar language faded in. One of us is afraid. It is not the unarmed non-combatant from the death world. The message broadcasted, and as her small, fragile shuttle lifted off from the Citadel, its silver hull gleaming against the void, we watched the main screen in horrified silence. Her ship was a single spark flying towards a raging inferno. Then, the impossible happened. One of the Cathar's forward destroyers, a vessel named the Oathkeeper, suddenly broke formation. Its weapon ports glowed, but it didn't target the approaching Vorlag fleet. It turned slowly and deliberately to face Grak Thul's flagship. A moment later, 2 more destroyers mirrored the move, then a cruiser, then a dozen more ships. An audio channel crackled to life, broadcasting in the clear for all to hear. It was the voice of the Oathkeeper's captain, a low, guttural growl, shaking with a rage that was deeper than war. "Grak Thul, you have no honor," the captain bellowed. "You have broken the sacred oath. Your soul is hollow. You are not Cathar." In the space of 10 seconds, the disciplined Cathar battle fleet, the terror of the galaxy for a century, devolved into a chaotic maelstrom of internecine violence. The war against the Vorlag hegemony was forgotten, replaced by a holy war against their own leader. The Cathar Civil War was as brief as it was brutal, a century of repressed warrior fanaticism, now unchained from its singular purpose, turned inward with terrifying efficiency. The ships loyal to Grak Thul, those whose captains were either too corrupt or too afraid to defy him, were systematically dismantled by their former comrades. The Indomitable Will, a vessel that had shrugged off entire volleys of Vorlag plasma, was torn apart by the concentrated fire of its own fleet. Its final explosion was a silent, brilliant starburst on our main view screen, the funeral pyre for a warlord and an entire era of galactic politics. We watched, our entire command staff frozen in a state of collective shock. We had prepared for the greatest battle in our history, and instead, we were spectators at an execution. The battle, if it could be called that, was over in less than an hour. A new leader, the captain of the Oathkeeper, whose name was Voral Khan, hailed us. His face appeared on the screen. He looked exhausted, his carapace singed, but his eyes burned with a renewed, fanatical light. He did not offer a surrender. To a Cathar, that was still an impossibility. He offered a truce. He stated, his voice resonating with absolute conviction, our war was with the Oathbreaker Grak Thul and his hollow creed. It was not with the Vorlag hegemony. We have cleansed our honor. The conflict is without purpose. And just like that, the century-long war was over. The Cathar fleet, what remained of it, turned and withdrew from the Xylos system, their mission of self-purification just beginning. There was no treaty, no celebration, just a sudden gaping silence where a war used to be. Into that silence, Ava Rostova's shuttle returned. It drifted back to the Citadel landing bay, its hull pristine, not a single scorch mark on it. She had flown into the heart of the enemy fleet and returned without a scratch, having ended the war without firing a single shot. The doors to the war room hissed open, and she walked in, the same small, soft-shelled creature in a simple uniform. But the atmosphere was different. The towering armored generals who had once mocked her now parted for her as if she were a celestial alignment. General Vrox, the great hammer of the hegemony, stood motionless, his mandibles clamped shut, his optic stalks all fixed on her. He looked small. There was no mockery now. There was no condescension. There was only a deep, profound, and terrified silence. I watched as she walked through the sea of frozen giants. My 4 optic stalks tracked her every move. my analytical mind utterly failing to categorize the event I had just witnessed. She had not used force. She had not used threats. She had used their own culture as a weapon, turning their most cherished principle into a self-destruct mechanism. She walked directly to my elevated scriptorium, to the console where I recorded the history of my people. She held up a small silver data chip. "My final report, High Scribe," she said, her voice as quiet and calm as the day she arrived. She placed the chip on the surface of my console. Then she offered me that same quiet, unsettling smile. I apologized for the mess. I could not respond. My vocalizer remained offline. My motor functions were locked. She had apologized for ending a century of bloodshed, for saving trillions of lives and incalculable resources, for achieving in a matter of weeks what the combined might of the Vorlag hegemony had failed to do in 100 years. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of that apology, the humanness of it, crashed my cognitive processes for a full 3 seconds. It was the longest 3 seconds of my life. Later, in the profound silence of the Grand Archive, I replayed the sequence of events. The chamber was cold, the data stacks humming with the stored knowledge of 1,000 generations. But all that knowledge, all that history of warfare and conquest, felt suddenly obsolete. It was a library of hammers in a universe that had just introduced the concept of the virus. I isolated every action taken by the human, Eva Rostova. I analyzed the weapon she had deployed. It had no mass. It had no energy signature. It was an abstraction. It was a story. A fact, a comparison. She had taken disparate, seemingly useless pieces of information, a forgotten myth, a logistical record, a children's rhyme, a biometric feed, and she had woven them into a narrative of betrayal. She had not attacked the Cathar. She had simply held up a mirror and forced them to see the corruption that was already there. I compared this to Vorlag's strategic doctrine. Our approach to the Cathar's unbreakable honor was to treat it as a fortress wall. Our plan was to pound that wall with artillery, kinetic, plasma, psionic, for as long as it took for the wall to crumble. We assumed that enough force applied over enough time would solve any problem. It was a wasteful, brutal, and, as I now realized, deeply stupid strategy. The human didn't try to break the wall. She didn't even touch the wall. She walked around it, examined its foundations, and found a single, loose stone. A cultural anxiety about broken oaths. Then, with the delicate precision of a master artisan, she tapped that stone. And the entire fortress, a structure that had withstood our siege for 100 years, collapsed into ruin under its own weight. I pulled up her biometric data again, the logs from her time in the war room, in the archive, in that suicidal flight toward the Cathar fleet. The calm, that terrifying, placid calm. I finally understood it. It was not the peace of a non-combatant. It was the absolute icy control of an apex predator. It was the stillness of a venomous creature that knows it doesn't need to roar or charge to be the deadliest thing in the ecosystem. It simply needs to wait, to watch, and to deliver its single, fatal bite with perfect timing. My thoughts drifted to the name her people gave their own planet, Earth. We translated it as dirt or soil, something primitive and foundational. But the file also called it a death world, a world of crushing gravity, of constant tectonic upheaval, of a billion species locked in a relentless, chaotic struggle for survival. A world where predators didn't just hunt with teeth and claws, but with camouflage, with mimicry, with poison and traps. What kind of mind would such a world forge? Not a mind that thinks in terms of overwhelming force, but a mind that thinks in terms of leverage. A mind that understands that the biggest creature can be brought down by the smallest parasite. A mind that knows how to turn an enemy's strength, its size, its very nature, into the instrument of its own destruction. Eva Rostova hadn't won a battle. She had demonstrated a new kind of physics. I returned to my primary console, the one from which I maintained the official records of the hegemony. The silence of the archive felt heavy now, freighted with a new and terrible understanding. I called up the file, the one I had sealed with such arrogant certainty what felt like a lifetime ago. The words on the screen seemed to mock me. Terran Liaison Officer Eva Rostova, classification, non-combatant. It was more than an error. It was a categorical failure of imagination. It was proof that our entire system of understanding the universe was flawed. We had categories for warships, for troop strengths, for weapon yields. We had no category for a creature who could dismantle an empire with a story. With a trembling appendage, the same one that had once dismissed her with a chuckle, I activated my highest authority clearance. I bypassed the standard classification protocols and opened a new, custom designation field. This field was reserved for phenomena that defied conventional strategic analysis, for existential threats, for forces of nature, for concepts like black holes or self-replicating nanite swarms. Things you didn't fight, but could only hope to endure. I deleted the word non-combatant. The cursor blinked, waiting. What was she? Psychological warfare specialist was too limited, a technical term for a process that felt more like sorcery. Grand strategist implied she operated on the same plane as our generals, which she clearly did not. They played a game with pieces on a board. She had reached into the board and changed the nature of the pieces themselves. I typed a new classification, 2 words, gravity weapon. It felt right. A gravity weapon doesn't burn or blast a target. It doesn't shatter it from the outside. It finds the target's center of mass, its core identity, and it increases its pull until the target collapses in on itself under the weight of its own existence. That is what she had done to the Cathar. She had weaponized their own honor. She had made it so heavy they could no longer stand. I saved the file. Then, with a sense of cold, historical dread, I transmitted the updated classification to the High Commander and the innermost circle of the Vorlag hegemony. An automated alert pinged back, a query from the system AI, asking me to confirm a classification that had no precedent. I confirmed it. The war with the Cathar was over, but my analysis of the data told me something far more dangerous had just begun. The Terrans were not our junior partners. They were not our scrappy allies. They were a context problem for which the galaxy had no frame of reference. They were a species that had evolved in a crucible of chaos, and they carried that chaos within them, hidden behind a calm smile and quiet words. And I knew, with the chilling certainty of a prophet reading a terrible truth in the data streams, that their most dangerous weapons would never appear on any scanner, would never carry a designation number, and would never, ever fire a single shot. My regulated internal temperature, a marvel of Vorlag bioengineering, suddenly felt inadequate. A shiver, a primitive, uncontrolled tremor ran through my body. The universe had not gotten smaller with the end of the war. It had become infinitely larger and unboundedly more terrifying.